Thank you. Welcome to Myanmar and welcome to Mizzima for this interview. Let's start to talk about the state of activism in worldwide today. What do you view about the state of activism today in the world?
Well, thanks a lot, and it's a privilege to be talking to you. I believe that activism is in a very interesting moment of reshaping itself and to bridge the more traditional ways of organizing activism with the new ones. So what I mean by that? I believe that the activism as my generation did, your generation did in relation to the ways of organizing people, the ways of mobilizing people, the ways of build awareness and consciousness from below, and then have a long movement towards change remains very important. I think it's not gone. So if you are a landless person in Brazil, or a Dalit in India, or a person living in Islam in Johannesburg, there is still a lot of that consciousness building from below, organizing through different kinds of associations and movements, and mobilizing towards their rights. At the same time, you have quite an important transformation that was brought by technology. So you've got new, I would say, shortcuts or short paths of mobilizing, where I'll give an example. On my times of organizing and mobilizing people for democracy in Brazil on the early 80s, just before the end of dictatorship, it would take us 6, 7, 8 months of work to put 100,000 people on the streets. And nowadays it can happen in a much faster pace because of the use of social media, particularly the use of mobile technology, and Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth. So I think those two worlds of activism, they coexist and sometimes they coincide. And I think they come together in a very powerful moments of change. Examples of that powerful moments for change, very recent ones, I would say the Fees Must Fall campaign in South Africa, in which students of across South Africa, where I'm living now, they came together to demand not to have any increase on the fees, and they won. And there was an excellent combination of mobilization using mobile phones and social media with concrete, on-site, real mobilizations and negotiations with the government and with the university leadership. I would also see the Black Lives Matter movement in the US as an interesting new way in which you combine those two. In parallel to that process of bridging different ways of organizing, you also have the online activism, which is also quite big and quite important. So you have many organizations that are doing online petitions, online ways of mobilizing, which I think they do add value in terms of putting pressure on some issue, or raising awareness, or involve different sectors of the media and even decision makers. However, if they don't connect with the real people on the real issues, I think the ability to really build a transformative change becomes compromised. I think transformative change requires people.
How about the effectiveness of activism? If you compare the time when you started activism years ago and now, what is the difference in terms of effectiveness? For example, the activism or activist campaign ending the war, or stopping the war, or ending the poverty. What is the effect? Whether the effectiveness is the same? You talk about the transformation. How about the effectiveness? And do you really able to make the change?
Yeah, I believe that there has been also quite a lot of change recently. If you look at, we have the classic activism of the 70s, like Stop Vietnam War, or even before, the civil rights activism, or the anti-apartheid activism, or anti-dictatorship in Latin America, and many, many examples across the world. They were very effective, and so were very effective the activism in the early 2000s. For instance, we did stop the WTO ministerial Cancun conference, which was a few years ago. I'll give an example that I'm very close to in my region. We used to have a proposal by the US and most of the governments in the region back in the 90s to create a free trade area of Americas, that our activism has defeated it. Another example is if you look at the struggle of the people living with HIV and AIDS and the access to medicines and to the antiretrovirals, they have won the right to access treatment. So I think there has been quite important victories more recently as well. So that effectivity, I think in a way, it has been maintained. I think we are still winning lots of battles, but it's also a moment in the world where inequality is so huge, and particularly inequality of power. And that inequality of power makes the life of activists much more difficult, because you have a concentration of wealth and power in very few hands, and they capture the state. So therefore, I would say we continue to be effective, but the other side is also becoming quite powerful. So new forms are quite required. What I think has been quite interesting is the ability to mobilize beyond the usual constituency of the activism movements. So the fact that the use of technology and use of creative, well, at our time was like arts and use of arts for that, but I think more and more now that many forms of activism are mobilizing and are reaching out to a much larger group, and particularly are becoming very powerful in the relationship with the youth. And I think it's still been quite important to stop issues like land grab, to stop issues related to abuse of corporate power, to also now more and more mobilize for the right, for the freedom of association and freedom of mobilization. So I think it continues to be a fit, but it's different because the world is different.
The question of solidarity, we used to see strong solidarity and solidarity support and network in the past, from one group to another, from one movement to another. How about current state of solidarity movements around the world? Does it still exist? Is it still active enough to challenge for example, injustice in one country and in the world?
Well, I believe solidarity remains quite important. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, during the General Assembly, UN General Assembly in New York, we had one of the biggest climate marches in the world. It was like 300,000 people in the streets of New York, at the heart of the country that's the biggest polluter in the world. You had 300,000 people marching in solidarity with the other countries, themselves, and the planet. And that was a beautiful example of it. And who has organized it was the labor unions in the US, because they understand that if you don't have a fundamental change on the economy, we will not only not be able to have a sustainable future, but we also not be able to generate jobs and decent jobs. So I think that's a good example of solidarity. I'll give you another one. We, as we speak, actually work in hundreds of communities across the world, and our work supporting and empowering communities from below and also mobilizing them to claim rights is supported by individuals in all kinds of countries, from Brazil to Italy to Greece to UK, and those individuals support the struggles elsewhere. I'm also seeing a lot of interaction between youth movements. I think that level of conversation is happening in a beautiful way, and I would say the World Social Forum on the past decade was also an important space to mobilize those new forms of solidarity. I would probably see where you see, I would probably observe that in the key moments of global decision making, you have great opportunities for that solidarity to materialize on political action. So I mentioned the climate change negotiations. I would also definitely mention the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think they were approved by countries because of a very strong civil society mobilization, both on North and South, towards solidarity. So I'm still quite confident that in spite of all the wrong incentives and sometimes the very xenophobic or racist fears in certain parts of the world that may undermine elements of solidarity, we still have a very strong solidarity that, at least in our case in ActionAid, allows a very strong network of local experiences of building power from below to claim for rights.
You started activism in Brazil, in Latin America, where activism and resistance against repression has been very strong. So when you do your work in other countries, like for example in Myanmar, is it still the same that you see what you were doing in Brazil or Latin America and what you are doing now in countries like Asia? Is it relevant still?
I would definitely say it's relevant, although it's not the same. I think, of course, the change in context, the differences in context are so big that it's difficult to have the same. And also the difference in terms of generation and how different generations communicate to one another and build solidarity and build collective action. But I would definitely identify some few fundamentals that remain quite strong. One of them is consciousness raising. So, and I observed this here in Myanmar on the past 2 days, to see farmers coming together and discussing their collective problems and starting to realize that that problem is beyond the community. There are other things that's happening outside the reach of the community that is affecting the community, so therefore they have to work on that, or farmers being able to talk to a chief minister in one of the places that I were to say, look, those are the things that you want to change in the agricultural plan. That comes from this process of conscientization, I think remains quite fundamental and important. The second, for me, concept that remains absolutely important is the concept of collective action. So everywhere in the world that we work, when we see people coming together with a common purpose and strategizing together, I think that remains absolutely fundamental to be able to achieve change in whatever scale. And the issue of leadership. I think the ability to have collective leadership and people being led by themselves as opposed to being led by others, I think remain quite important in terms of the legitimacy of the cause and the ability to push towards that right. And finally, I would say the issue of building constituency and support from others. So the ability of those experience of activism to communicate with and to interact with and bring together a much larger range of organizations, movements, media, medium class, students towards their cause is being very important. Like recently, if you look at movements such as all the climate movement, it brings together, like from fisher folks in the delta areas of Bangladesh with farmers of Africa that are affected by droughts, with people that who live the consequence of the Arctic. It brings together social justice activists with environmental activists. So I think there is this element of intersectionality where struggles become much more collective and you bring different movements together. It's probably another new feature where we have some struggles that are collective struggles that brings together different kinds of movements and different I would say sectors, like the environmental sector together. One concrete example on that, we have discussed that on the face of inequality, women's rights attacks and patriarchy, in the face of climate change, in the face of shrinkage of political space, we need to bring together a larger group of organizations, and we even had a manifesto signed by ActionAid, Oxfam, Greenpeace, Amnesty, and the Trade Unions Confederation, ITUC. So that shows like how we bring together environmental organizations, poverty eradication development organizations, and labor unions, so that we have to do it together. There is no way that we can achieve transformational change alone. We need to come together, and I think there is much more openness nowadays to really strategize collectively.
In an ideal world where the government is responsible to take care of the well-being of the people, but we see governments failing. So what is the role of activists or civil society or communities in filling up where the governments are failing, particularly, for example, the question of inequality between, especially the growing gap between rich and poor. So what exactly these activists and the civil society and communities could do, where the governments are largely failing?
Yeah, I think to great extent, many places where the government is failing is very related to what you just mentioned on inequality. It's not only failing because the government has not sufficient resources. Sometimes it's failing because those scarce resources are being monopolized by powerful groups. So, leadership is about choice, and when a government has to choose between giving credit to poor farmers or giving credit to rich farmers, that's a choice. And because of the reality of inequality in many parts of the world, the elites, either national or international elites, have captured the state. So therefore the state prioritize activities that are beneficial to those elites. One example is the taxation system. So you have many countries in the world that will give a full tax exemption to a big company, and we still charge tax on a small business. So that's an example of that capture. My sense is that the role of activism is exactly to look at that equation of the capture of the state by the powerful, to be able to build power with people in a way that you become so powerful that you can confront the capture of the state. And that process of disputing the resources and making sure that the state serves the majority requires a number of issues. I think number one, the ability of people that live in exclusion and poverty to have the consciousness and the strength to make the case visible and to build power on the format of mobilization organizations that can really make their voice heard. I think second is an element of the ability to understand how the state operates, understand budgets, understand lawmaking, understand decision making, understand budget allocation, and therefore be able to interfere and to lobby or campaign at the very right time so you can confront that capture of the state at the day by day. So when a local authority has to make a decision to spend the money with the poor farmers or spend the money with something that has nothing to do with the poor farmers, that the poor farmer will know what that moment is and will be able to bring their claims at the right time. I would also say it has to do with the ability to look at some structural issues that allow the capture of the state. So I just mentioned taxation is one of them. I think that's a fundamental issue for societies to create progressive taxation that would allow a redistribution of power and resources, but also would allow a very effective state capacity, revenue capacity to fulfill its obligations to protect, promote human rights and to ensure everyone's access to services. So I think that's one crucial structural issue, as well as the issue of democratic space for the movements. Because by the end of the day, if you don't have the space in which you can freely organize yourselves and you can freely mobilize for your rights, it will be very difficult to confront the capture by the interests of the elites.